It's true. Two-term senator and longtime political figure Tom Udall announced this week that he will not seek re-election to a third term in 2020. Although he was favored by pundits to win re-election next year, his announcement set off a flurry of speculation over his reasons certainly for leaving and who might replace him in the Senate especially. Here with us this week to discuss this topic is this week's opinion panel. Line regular and attorney Sophie Martin is with us. Another familiar face, Diane Snyder, former Republican state senator, is with us. University of New Mexico political science professor emerita, Christine Sierra is with us. And a new face, welcome to Crystal Ciarza, the CEO of Ciarza Social Digital and a familiar face to the business community here in Albuquerque. Glad you're here.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming. Sophie, starting with you, Senator Udall's announcement came as a bit of a surprise for pundits and political watchers. Were you surprised? If yes, why? If no, why?
You know, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it before.
That's a good point, right?
It was kind of like, you know, I got to get some more. I got to go shopping. I got to do this, do my job, and then thinking about it. But on some level, it seems to me that 2020 is not expected to be a great year nationally for Republicans. At the moment that we're taping this, there are 34 Senate seats up for grabs now, including Senator Udall's. There's a fair chunk of Republican in there. Right. And so, you know, if you're going to go, this isn't a bad time to do it if you're looking to try and make sure that, you know, as a Democrat, you're followed up with a Democrat. The other thing we see right now in New Mexico is that there's a much stronger Democratic pool to pull from in terms of potential replacement candidates than there is Republicans. And that is, to a certain extent, I think, borne out in how badly the Republicans were shellacked in 2018 in statewide and local races. And so it seems kind of like the perfect time. And I have to believe that all of that went into his thinking about when to make his announcement.
Yeah. Crystal, interestingly, let's talk about who's not going to be running to replace him. We might as well just go there. Who's going to replace him is the most fun of this.
Yeah.
We learned on Thursday morning that our Hector Balderas is not going to be running because he has family commitments and he has a job that he likes.
Yes.
Mayor Keller has said he's not running. But we had an interesting quote from Deb Haaland, our first term rep here in District 1. She was a little, kind of like, I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? How did that strike you? I mean, she hasn't even been in the office but for a number of months now.
I really respect Representative Haaland for being an ambitious individual, not only in her professional career, but also on her political career. Right. But it wouldn't be a bad idea for her just to at least evaluate to see if there's an opportunity there. But I'm sure that others would probably agree with her, especially those within New Mexico, would probably say she's got a job to do and that's the job that she should ultimately stick to. Right. That's not to say, though, if she decides to go for that level of ambition, then good for her. Right. And I think that's great. What I found really interesting, especially through searching through social media, is who's actually said that they've decided to talk about an exploratory committee or who's decided to actually run. Obviously, in many different areas, I've heard the big story that came out was about Representative Lujan being a really great opportunity, but the House would lose him and his, not only his seniority, but also his amount of power and his amount of responsibility as, you know, being so involved in the Hispanic caucus, et cetera. Maggie Toulouse Oliver is always a popular name that kind of supports the argument of how, you know, the Democrats have some really interesting people to pull from. You know, former gubernatorial candidate Jeff Apodaca, Raul Torres. I think the one that was really interesting to me that already decided to say that he's looking at an exploratory committee was a former House representative candidate, a local district candidate, Giovanni Alexander Hakani. I thought that was a really interesting name to see on the docket as potentially somebody that's interested in running for U.S. Senate, especially since he has a presence in Albuquerque. Now on the Republican side. Let
me hold you on that one. I want to get to the Republican side here in a quick second, but I don't want to finish with Democrats here in a quick second. You know, the Senate is not for neophytes.
No.
Do you know what I mean? It just isn't. I don't care if it's in the state legislature or in Washington. Of the names that are out there from the Democratic side, how many are really in play in your mind? How many are really out there? Because you have to have statewide ID, you have to be able to raise money statewide. There's a lot of things that go into a Senate run that.
Right. I think for the Democrats, the natural choice is Congressman Ben Ray Lujan. Yeah. He has not only made a name for himself, but he has a family name. Now, the drawback is, you mentioned statewide identity. He has that even though he's never run for a statewide office. Gotcha. Because he has been visible enough within the House. He has been very successful. Also for him, looking at decisions, some of the things I have noticed and spoken about is he is tied in many ways to Speaker Pelosi.
Yes.
And she is moving on up there in age and won't be there a whole lot longer. Whereas it's a natural progression for Ben Ray to move to the Senate. And we haven't had a Hispanic senator since Dennis Chavez.
Fair point.
Maybe.
Fair point.
I think that would
right.
be. I think that would be good for New Mexico. I think yes, he would technically lose his seniority, but his name ID and his identity and the fact he has been in Congress these number of years will translate and move over into the Senate.
Sure.
I just don't see the others. I have to tell you, I was absolutely fell off my chair when I read Congresswoman Holland's comments. I'm going, you've got 3 months of legislative experience, and you want to go into the Senate and be one of the 100. I mean, I understand politically that's a nice ambition, and it's a whole lot more fun to be in the Senate than the House where you have to run so many times. But to me, she doesn't have the credentials.
Right.
So I'm sorry in some ways that Hector is not running. I do think he carries the credentials to do it, and he does have statewide name ID.
Right.
So I think he had the possibility. He would be second, in my opinion. Maggie Toulouse Oliver is an outstanding young woman, but she's only been in the county clerk or secretary of state arena, and that's more election related. That is the biggest responsibility of that position. So I see her experience is somewhat limited.
Gotcha.
So I still go back to Hector served in the House, he served as AG, that he qualified, that his experience is more. So I'm sorry that he's not running. I think that would be viable. And particularly if Congressman Lujan chooses not to run.
That's a
if he
good point.
chooses to stay in the House, then I'm very concerned about the Democrat list.
That's an interesting point, that last point there. I had not thought about that. If he, in fact, decides not to, Christine Sierra, that would be very interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
You know, the field would shift markedly.
I would agree with the senator that Ben Ray Lujan has a lot of favors to call in terms of people that he's helped.
Sure.
Being in charge of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, that means that he was looking at where to place money to support Democratic Party candidates all across the country. And the way I see it is also kind of within the hierarchy of the Congress, of the U.S. Congress, his moving up.
Right.
I agree with you that Hector Balderas, when I first heard the initial names, I thought, he has statewide recognition.
Right.
He's very prominently going after high-profile cases. And everybody knows, I think, about our former athletic director at UNM and pursuing that, and among other things.
Right.
So I do agree that, and maybe Mr. Balderas will change his mind.
Right.
But I see them as a slightly different and advantageous field in different arenas. Now, having said that, I want to add that I agree with Sophie in that 2020 seems to be an advantage for Democrats because in 2018, the good showing in New Mexico, Democrats are committed to keeping that infrastructure going and getting a high turnout. It's a presidential election. It will be a high turnout. Now, while President Trump has his supporters and they are not wavering among the Republicans.
They're not growing either.
But that's right.
Yes.
But it is getting crossover, those Republican women to cross over.
That's right.
The Democrats getting the independents and getting a very energized anti-Trump electorate of Democratic Party voters.
Interesting point there. We got about 2 minutes left. I want to split between Sophie and Crystal. Let's talk about Republicans for a quick sec. As Christine just mentioned them. Steve Pierce's name has been out there. You mentioned former Lieutenant Governor John Sanchez.
Steve Pierce,
Mick
so
Rich has announced,
exciting, so exciting. I'm
Mr. Rich lost by 23 points.
Same
Martin
there,
Heinrich.
same there. It's I mean, as I said before, I think it's a tough it's a tough situation for Republicans because they don't really have a marquee candidate to put out there. The state knows Steve Pierce from previous election tries.
right.
He's probably the biggest name Republican that we have in the state right now, and he hasn't succeeded statewide ever.
What do you
and
think?
so,
It's true too. What do you think about Judith Nakamura, our Supreme Court?
I have a great deal of respect for Chief Justice
Sure.
Nakamura. I haven't, her name has been floated, but I haven't heard that she has been floating her own name.
Right.
Whereas with
There's a difference, right?
Yeah. Whereas with Mark Rich, that's a very different situation. So that's certainly a wait and see.
That's right.
But I do think that she would be an interesting candidate and would bring a lot of attention to
A lot of
the
cred,
Republican side.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Interesting, Valerie Plame's name's been floating out there the last day or so,
Yeah.
starting Thursday morning.
It's a very fascinating name to see, especially with national attention, but that doesn't mean that her donors, or she might actually not, we don't know what her political camp looks like.
Right.
And to every candidate, that the camp is almost really the ticket to the seat. And so I'm curious to see how she does, especially if she has the resources and she has the dollars to raise. I think one of the other several names that I saw within Republican circles, especially in some of the industries that I work with, even though she might not be considered, she's at least considered for being the next face of the Republican Party, is Claire Chase. Many of you may not have heard of Claire Chase, but she's been a lobbyist, especially for the oil and gas industry,
Right.
president of NMOGA and the president of IPA&M. And along with Mick Rich, she's as influential in those certain areas. And remember, there's a big chunk of eastern New Mexico that all of these candidates have to satisfy, and she's very well respected in that area because of her efficiency. When it comes to the state legislature, or even for up in Washington, D.C., she knows how to advocate, she knows how to fight. She's very much representative of the young Republicans that are in that area, which is the future of the party. So even though if she hasn't put her name into the race, or if she isn't somebody that is saying yes or no, I think she's a very fascinating person to at least watch from the Republican Party, just because of her amount of influence and efficiency when it comes to
Well, let's see what
One
happens
person
if.
y'all haven't
please.
mentioned is John Sanchez.
Oh, Joan Sanchez, sure,
Yeah.
of course,
Not
right.
one of you mentioned John Sanchez,
That's
and to
right.
me, he's the leading contender. in
Oh,
the
no kidding.
race.
Why so?
Absolutely.
In 20
because
seconds, if
he
you could.
is extremely well liked around the state.
Gotcha.
He's won statewide elections. He distanced himself enough from Governor Martinez. He didn't run this time. He was smart enough to know not to run this time.
Right.
And I just think I would not underestimate John at all.
He's a young man still as
He's a
well.
young
yeah,
man.
Absolutely. Interesting point there. I like that discussion. A lot of interesting things here with this race. That's all the time we have on that topic, though, but still to come this week on The Line, a national bill to address the health care shortage in rural New Mexico.